Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Titan Radio with Chris Peralta and Rory Anton. On this week's show, we'll be talking about the key metrics used by athletes and coaches when wearing GPS sensors. We'll also discuss in detail these key metrics and what we're looking for throughout games and practices. How are you today then, Chris?
I'm good. How are you, Rory?
Good. I can't complain.
I can complain. It's raining a lot in Houston right now.
Yeah, that's very true.
You're from Scotland.
I'm kind of used to it. It doesn't really get me down anymore.
How you feeling about the Rangers game?
Good result. Yeah, good result. Obviously in Europe, Celtic got a good result for Scotland as well, so it's looking on the up for Scottish football. Can't complain.
It's good. I'm really glad we got the first episode out of the way. I felt like it was a bit awkward.
Yeah.
Um, you were like, "Hello and welcome."
Yeah, a little bit robotic to start with, but hopefully we'll settle into it this week.
At least we got started. That's all that matters.
We got it out of the way. That's the main thing. It's taken us a little while to get the second one too. But, I'm sure we'll get into a rhythm shortly.
So, as we mentioned, we'll be talking about just different topics, current events in GPS, talk about different, type of ways people in teams use them because there are different roles, obviously, in different teams. Some college programs, they don't have a sports scientist, right? So some of them it's a graduate assistant maybe, or some of them it's an assistant coach. And others, there's obviously a more robust type of team. There's a bigger department that uses it. So we'll be getting different types of feedback from different, I guess, people, roles in sport. So hopefully that'll be next week. We have our first caller, so super excited about that.
Yeah, I think once we get into kind of the coach's background, I'm sure people will probably be fed up of our voices even by week 2. So I think having people call in will be a huge asset to us, and really looking forward to kind of people's feedbacks, what they want, on the podcast, and what they are kind of looking for from us. So kind of leading on from that, Chris, kind of break down what in your discussions with coaches, what have kind of been the key metric for the majority of coaches, or like you said, people in other roles.
Yeah, so I work with obviously a lot of the South American teams, college programs as well. And for the most part, everyone kind of does or kind of focuses on the five specific, between 5 to 7 metrics. So typically it's usually in acceleration, impacts, sprints, and/or kind of high speed runs, distance covered, and then the most important one, training load, right? Because I think training load is kind of the metric that started off the GPS space to be able to kind of track that on a daily, weekly basis.
Yeah, and that's kind of been a hot topic right now, right? With load management, Kawhi sitting out second game of the season, and so interested to see your kind of take on that, and it's a current events, current topic for us, so definitely very relevant to our time.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two different ways to look at it. Look at it from kind of the spectator point of view, and maybe the owner point of view, like Michael Jordan said. He said, if I'm paying my players for 82 games, I expect them to play in 82 games. But there's also the view of the team doctor, or maybe the team physio, being more conscious about, okay, is it more important for them to kind of be fit and play in the first 40, 50 games of the season, or do you want them in tip-top shape for playoffs? So me, obviously, if I'm a spectator, if I'm paying, if I go to a Rockets game to see LeBron and I pay $300 for my tickets, which I'd want to see LeBron, right?
Yeah.
But obviously, for load management purposes, maybe he sits out the game. So I don't know. It's kind of working in the GPS point of it and working in the just athlete monitoring side business of it. I see both sides. What about you?
Yeah, obviously, I think it's definitely an interesting thing him sitting out already. I think he's obviously a player that comes under a lot of criticisms with his injuries, and obviously we had that year at the Spurs, right, where there was a lot of arguments and whatnot. Um, but yeah, I totally agree. I think I want to see players competing at their best against the best, and I think that's playoff basketball. And at the end of the day, if he needs to sit out a couple of games now to be fresh, then by all means. But I think it also has become a little bit of a catchphrase for some NBA guys to like, maybe it's one that he's circled out that he doesn't see as a key game, and it comes down to that sometimes instead of actually the ins and outs and the sports science behind it.
So you coach at the collegiate level, right? Basketball. You obviously have a big network in that area as well. What have you been hearing, or what is your opinion on it in terms of when you were at coaching at your college, or maybe some colleagues of yours? Like what's their opinion on it?
Yeah, obviously I was fortunate enough to be at Houston Baptist the last couple of years. Shout out to them; they got their first win the other night. So yeah, in our experience, we had players that maybe struggled with knee issues and could maybe only go once or twice a week, and maybe there was only so much they could take loading throughout the week, and there's even it even comes to a situation where game one in the week is more important than game two, and obviously that's more of a thing at professional level. You obviously target those in conference games and whatnot. So I think in basketball especially, it's about knowing your players, listening to them. Obviously, with GPS now, we can also quantify those numbers, and we can kind of see, have a better understanding of our players and just know when the time is right for them to maybe sit out a practice session so that they're fresh for the game at the weekend, or maybe play limited minutes in a game where we're up 20 points, because next game on the schedule is going to be a tough one and we need them at their best. And that can even be simple things like in soccer, uh, players only being a part of the shaping drills in a Friday session before a Saturday game because maybe they're struggling with injury. They've put too much in their legs already that week in terms of load, and maybe it's just time for them to kind of taper it back and just only be involved in the tactical session in that game so that it's a little bit less for them to take on that Friday session.
So, interestingly enough, I just found this article and it talks about, I didn't know this actually, but the NBA prohibits teams from resting healthy players in high profile nationally televised games and can levy a $100,000 fine against teams who break the rule. Did not know that, but apparently enforcing that rule has been pretty hard for them lately, and even just since 2017, which is a rule was instituted. Do you think it will ever be, I guess, easier for the NBA to police this rule, or do you think just the way that the sports science field's changing, it's only kind of just going against them more?
I know I kind of mentioned it in the last podcast, and since the Rugby World Cup's kind of over now, but I think rugby do a great, the International Rugby Board, sorry, do a great job of policing it. And they've now said that everyone must have a load management strategy in place. And I think that's how you kind of combat that. Like these guys have to be kind of healthy for the majority of what an 82 game season. I think there has to be an implementation from NBA conferences, you know, like governing bodies, I guess, to say like you have to have a load management strategy in place so that you can track it, and also so that you can kind of make sure that players are ready for those big games, right? Lakers Clippers this year is going to be a huge game. I'm sure the NBA don't want LeBron James sitting out in that, so they probably want him to be ready to go for that game, as probably the teams want their best players to be going because that's going to be a huge game for them.
Right, and I think it's also kind of take into consideration the season, right? How long the season is, how short the season is. Obviously, baseball has tons of games. The NBA has what, like 82 regular
Hmm.
season
Yeah.
games. It's a little bit different than college football, right? Especially with rankings, especially with kind of the pressure to kind of beating obviously big game this weekend, number one versus number two, LSU Alabama. Tua is injured at the moment, right? But you fully expect him to play if you're Alabama or even if you're LSU, right? So it's like kind of that decision between, okay, will he help us essentially put us into the college football playoff kind of deal, or can we risk resting him, right? And it also goes into kind of how deep you are as a team at the quarterback or whatever receiver or whatever position, right, is missing. But um, yeah, really interesting stuff, and we'll see how this kind of folds out, especially with the NBA taking into consideration that rule.
Yeah, definitely. I think it will be a big one for the kind of next season or so for them to implement strategies to kind of monitor that. So moving on from kind of GPS session load, let's go ahead and speak a little bit on acceleration, deceleration. So Chris, what are obviously you coach, weekends and stuff. What's your kind of take on acceleration, deceleration, and its kind of impact in team sports?
Yeah, so I think a few ways. I think you can tailor conditions. For example, take into account goalkeepers, center backs. So obviously they won't have the most distance coverage in a game. They might not even have the most sprints in a game. But it doesn't mean that they won't have a high training load. And so, for example, it's really essential how quickly a center back can close down on a center forward, on a winger. And so that's, I think, what kind of can take into consideration when considering excel, decel, no different than a goalkeeper, and specifically for a goalkeeper, because if you're coaching 1v1s, something, a specific topic, right? Cutting off the angle, how quickly can you get off your line? It's really important, really really important. And now, as you know, that half second, that second that you can save, it makes a massive difference. um, and it's what really, like, a lot of goalkeepers even train, right? I'm not sure how often it's trained, but I know it's definitely. I mean, how many 1v1s do you think happen in a game?
1v1s in a
Yeah,
game is, I mean, it depend on the level.
Premier League,
I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 for both sides probably.
right?
So
And
like
I
two
mean,
or three a team.
exactly. And being able to, a really good team and a really good side, they need one chance to score on you.
Yeah,
Simple as that.
exactly. Yeah, so kind of touching on acceleration, deceleration, I think a lot of the time, um, people talk about acceleration is kind of, the main thing. Um, Deceleration's hugely important. I think coaches can really dive in and get a better idea of their player profile. Um, and honestly, like the the injury prevention side of deceleration is huge. So, talking with strength coaches, they train a lot on like landing metrics, right? And it's no different for deceleration. Because you got to train basically people to get their foot pattern right, take the right amount of steps, get their posture right to kind of slow themselves without putting their body at risk of injury. Um, and I think that's something that's massively overlooked as well is, everyone wants to be faster, stronger, better. Like how efficient can you be? Like if I get beat one on one by someone and it's just purely because I, have sprinted straight, let's say in soccer, I sprint as a left back, I've sprinted out to the right midfielder and he's just blown by me. That's deceleration, right? Not every movement is gonna be benefited by being like extremely quick, extremely fast off the mark. And going back to your goalkeeper kind of example is like, yeah, you want to be quick off the line, but like you don't want to, sprint out and leave yourself in no man's land, right? Like kind of sprint out to a certain extent, get your feet set and, decelerate to a stop and keep your feet active, ready to kind of make that save.
Yeah, definitely. What's the next metric we have on the list?
Let's go with distance covered.
Distance covered. So with distance covered, I feel like just from the football perspective, uh, or soccer, from the coaching side, I would say preparing players during the week. to be able to perform at the level that you need them to on the weekend. And so I kind of alluded to this in the first podcast, but it's, if you're a team that plays three in the back, for example, your wingers will be covering a lot of distance, obviously, if they're tracking back correctly. So what you do during the week to prepare them to perform at that level and at that intensity will matter, and it will affect them greatly in their performance, right? So I think that is very important to kind of consider. Um, from, I would say, the positional stance, even if you want to compare, let's say you have two number 10s that are really good on your team, attacking midfielders, being able to compare what each one does. And obviously, you always have to pair the performance, what they do on the ball as well as what they do without the ball. But um, it's very interesting to see kind of those stats and being able to compare, your top two performers or who's outperforming who, and kind of does their performance correlate with kind of their numbers, right? And
Yeah.
so that's always interesting to see. I'd love to see Messi stats because if you look at him when he's not on the ball, he's walking the whole time.
Yeah.
But when he is on the ball, it's like he's
It's
speeding past you
yeah.
like a train.
Yeah. And exactly, I kind of had this conversation the other day with someone at, you know, Messi's kind of heat map would be another one that would be interesting to see because he's almost, constantly moving. Like it'd be hard to kind of get a full red dot, I think, for him, because he's like, so laterally quick, going side to side with the ball and uh, getting by players, and then you have people like Cristiano Ronaldo, right, who's just like a straight line like beast.
Just hugs the
Hugs it,
wing,
yeah,
hugs the touchline.
old school winger, like go and be friends with the touchline the whole game. So, no, it's definitely interesting to see how those kind of differ. In terms of distance covered, what are kind of the, I guess, the rule of thumbs or anything that you've heard? We talked about a little bit into loading, and I think distance covered sometimes comes into that, right? People kind of get caught up in tracking the distance covered throughout the week in training sessions versus game and that kind of stuff. What are the kind of rule of thumb for you, or as a coach, or maybe some sports science things you've heard before?
I wouldn't necessarily say I've heard like a rule of thumb for distance covered specifically, but I will say it's like I alluded to earlier, don't base their distance covered off of how much they're working, right? Because it's again going back to are they playing way out of position, right? Are they getting dragged out to somewhere that they don't need to be? And so that could have a lot to do with why they ran the most miles or kilometers in the full team. I think for the most part, it's like I mentioned earlier, preparing them to compete, right? So putting them in the positions, running the right sessions during the week to say, okay, this is how much I want you high up the field, and you'll need to be able to practice that, be able to execute that on the weekend, putting them in those positions. I think that's the most important one. And again, kind of just because they don't have the highest and distance covered doesn't mean that they necessarily, they could have 4 assists and 2 goals in that game.
Right.
Doesn't necessarily mean that they were the laziest, right? But
Yeah.
again, all depends on your system, kind of how you play and how you're preparing your team during the week.
Right. And with our team currently, our uh, one of our wingers is kind of the highest distance covered every week, but like he presses nonstop, right? So like he's pressing out of position because he's maybe not getting the support from behind, and then he's having to sprint to get back in as well. So like his numbers just blow everyone else away, um, week on week, and that kind of alludes to the fact that you said like you know if people are constantly out of position, then they're going to be sprinting a lot. Whereas if they're in position, they can jog, walk to kind of be there, constantly in the right shape, in the right formation, with or without the ball. But you kind of talked about work rates, kind of touch a little bit on kind of the difference in like high speed runs and sprints and how we define that at Titan, how it is defined, and maybe how it occurs in games.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information in terms of that we provide here at Titan with the speed zone information, and so with that being said, you get information on how much distance you cover at a certain speed, right? But also about how much time you spend in those speed bands or those speed zones. Everyone calls it something different, but we call it speed zones here at Titan. And so, from the teams that I work with personally, what they look at the most is high, kind of how much speed you're covering, or how, sorry, let me rephrase that, how high of a speed you're going and how much distance you're covering at that high speed. And repeatedly, how much do you do that? And so being able to gauge, okay, as the game's going on, when does it start to drop off a little bit, right? And that's why kind of the real time is real important sometimes and really beneficial for coaches, because being able to monitor that can give you a sense of, okay, he's basically got no gas left in the tank and he might need to come off soon. So, but the speed zone information is definitely, especially, being able to see how much distance was covered at the highest speed, and repeatedly, how much do they do that? How much time do they spend in those speed zones? That's the most important, right? For me, I think, based off of information that I've gotten from again, the teams that we work with, this is one of the most important metrics, especially in soccer and
Yeah.
football. And this is something that a lot of kind of sports scientists uh, look for. Is one of the first things that they want to generate a report of after a training session, especially after a game.
Yeah. And there's a lot of studies out there that most people don't, get to their maximum speed throughout a game, and it can take, 30 to 40 yard sprints, right, to get to that full, potential of a sprint. And obviously, there's been a lot of questions in like sprint training, and the best way to train for sprints is to sprint. A lot of people are,
You don't say.
yeah, exactly. No kidding. But a lot of people just underestimate that, I think. Don't really realize that, go out and do 5, 10 sprints to train to be faster in a game, right? Like that's kind of gone a little bit. Maybe it's a bit of the weight room mentality or whatever, but I think, for us, we're kind of quantifying, and you've kind of seen here top speeds. Nice, Chris, to pull up one of my performances there. Um, but
Let's
yeah,
talk about that performance.
I mean, hey, we tied at the weekend, but it's okay. I didn't play the most minutes, so
Speaking of, like you alluded to, kind of the best way to, to be faster and to work on your sprinting is sprinting,
yeah,
right? There's a lot of sprint specific coaches.
yeah.
How vital do you feel as sprint specific coaches to an organization, or even to, a professional athlete that's doing work in the off season?
Yeah, I think it can be massive. I know of several players, friends that play, back home and stuff, that they've really changed their game through, working with sprint coaches. Even there's a club local to me that I've worked with, cross country and sprint coaches to kind of get a better understanding of their guys, their top speed, all those kind of things to get a better, what they call a sprint profile, right? And they've seen great benefits. They're finding last 30, 40 minutes of the game, their guys have still got that extra sprint to, make it into the final third and maybe set up that goal, whereas other teams don't. So it can be hugely beneficial, especially, things like sprint patterns, footwork, that people have kind of worked on in the off season, can really bring a big impact. As you were saying, coaches look for those high speed instances in a game.
For sure. So, what are the other two metrics we had in mind?
So I believe impacts, right?
Yeah.
An impact is kind of like it starts when an acceleration exceeds 7.5 Gs, right? And then it tracks until you break that 2G threshold. So impact count, for example, during a game is how many impacts did you take that, was an instance where it was above 7.5 Gs and then broke through to 2. Um, and that's just a basic kind of count. And then kind of the, impact duration can look at, how long the impact lasted. So things in rugby, right? When you're rucking or you have a maul or something like that, then that impact is obviously going to last longer than someone taking a tap tackle or hitting the ground or something like that, right? So those are the key kind of things is the duration and how hard of an impact they're taking. Those are kind of the key measurements they're going to look out for in rugby. Um, and obviously, guys who are injured will be able to take a lot less, or maybe aren't at full recovery will be able to take a lot less. And there's been a lot of talk in rugby about whether there should be contact practices or non-contact practices. And that's, I mean, we'll definitely get some rugby coaches on here to kind of talk us through a bit more of how they're using it, to monitor those kind of things.
I'd love to see how they track like thresholds, like
Yeah,
impact thresholds for certain players. You know,
yeah,
because rugby
exactly.
guys are massive.
Yeah, and then obviously positionally as well, right? Because
Right.
you then get guys that are built a little bit more like soccer players who are play in the back, and they're still taking hits
They have
from
to be the
huge
fast
guys.
ones, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You have to be smart as well. Make sure you stay away from those impacts. So, yeah, no, definitely, it'd be interesting to kind of hear their take on that side of things.
All right, and I think the last one to wrap it up is the all kind of the most famous one, training load.
Yeah.
So talk about training load a little bit. What to you kind of in the simplest terms, or what's your personal definition of training load?
Um, so when I was coaching, you know, training load comes down to periodization, right? Like at the end of the day, it's a lot plays hand in hand. Um, for me, we talk about high load um, during a week of game day. Probably not a good idea, right? So low load, intensity we got to look at as well. Something we got to track. How hard are the sessions as well as how long are they. Which obviously can be tracked through speed zones, work rates, things like that. For me, with loading, it's just knowing your players, knowing how much they can, take throughout a week of game day, and coaches can look at charts through GPS sensors and manipulate the data to know when to pull a player. Obviously, if you've got real time, you can look at maybe put a cap on distance throughout a session and say, hey, once you hit this distance today, we're pulling you, um, and so on and so forth.
Yep, really good insight from the collegiate level. For me, just from the coached in high school a bit, coached at the youth academy level as well, and so for us it was more there. There are two different scenarios because high school season is very short, but a lot of games, sometimes up to 3 games a week. And so you have to be really strategic about kind of how you train, and really making sure that you don't have those high spikes, for example, in training load 2 days before a really important district game, for example. At the academy level is a little bit different because the games are kind of spread out more, as well as just, you train 4 times a week, and sometimes some days were more kind of core gym sessions, lower body. It's not as much running. It was more kind of just working on a little bit things, the position specific, right? And to me, training load is really, you don't need to you don't need to have a extensive background in any type of science to really understand it at the most basic level, right?
Yeah,
Obviously, I'm not going to claim to know more than a sports scientist at the Premier League because they've
yeah,
obviously, right, there's a reason they're there. But I think at the simplest terms, training load is just being able to take into consideration kind of the workload that you're putting on your players throughout
yeah,
the week, and just, at the end of the day, you want them to be fresh and 100% for game day,
yeah.
right? So just making sure that you don't have those high spikes, over 10% and kind of per day, um, and you should be good.
Yeah, sounds good. So next week on Titan Radio, we'll have our first call in. Looking forward to that, Chris. Maybe you can just sign us off here.
Yeah, stay tuned. Really happy to get this second one out the way. Hopefully, we're not as awkward for the third one.
Yeah,
We'll
well,
let the caller do most of the talking.
yeah, exactly. They'll be more of a natural than us.
All right, guys. Chris Peralta signing off here with Rory Anton. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Titan Sensor and Twitter. What's our Twitter, Rory?
At Titan Sensor.
There we go. All right.